Tonight's forum is the public finale of a month-long project which included the publication of the East Asian Forum Quarterly. We have our editor here. The quarterly special issue on China's investment abroad. Because you are here, we are providing a free copy for you at the back of the room. And a day-long roundtable discussion and debate on foreign direct investment, outbound investment from China. Today, we delve into the changing face of Chinese investment, causes and consequences, both for developed and developing countries. As further evidence of the very global importance of our topic, tonight we have the pleasure of hearing from our keynote speaker, Professor Jeffrey Sachs, Director of the Earth Institute here at Columbia, as well as a panel of distinguished speakers from US, China, South Africa, and Australia. Jeff Sachs is a renowned professor of economics and one of the very few economists who's a household name in the world, a leader in sustainable development and a senior advisor to successive leadership of the United Nations. He has done very important work on the fight against poverty, has been to, in the last count, 125 countries, perhaps 10 more since last week, perhaps. After Professor Sachs, our esteemed panel will join us to give their take on this subject. Please join me in welcoming Professor Sachs.
Shengjin, thank you very much, and wow, it's wonderful to have all of you here, and an honor for us at Columbia University to be hosting you, and many friends from China and Australia and Africa and overseas in many places. I want to say a word about Jerry Chazen, who I don't think is here with us today, is he? No, okay. Jerry's was a longtime trustee of Columbia University and a great business person and a person with a profound concern for the world, for the arts, for business, and he obviously made a marvelous contribution by establishing this center at Columbia Business School, and I just wanted to pay tribute to his leadership for doing that. Hi, Merit. How are you? So I know that you had a wonderful discussion today already in the internal roundtable, and I'm delighted to be a brief opening act for a great panel. I'll just speak for a few minutes. And I won't speak mainly about this extraordinary topic of China's own outward foreign investment, which is by itself a game changer. Everything about China deserves superlatives in terms of its rate of change and its scale of impact. And the stock of outward foreign investment, we know, is one of those superlatives, having risen roughly tenfold within a decade from 2000 to 2010. Everything about China's growth, though, has been a world changer. And I'm at least of that school that says this is fundamental. It is not a bubble. It's not something that's going to be reversed. It's part of an underlying very deep trend of catching up of China after, you could say, 200 years or 150 years of not such great luck. Or you could date it to 1433 if you want and say a few hundred years more than that. But China is catching up, and because of its size and importance and fundamental role in global culture and science, technology, and history, it's changing the entire world. There's nothing more important in the world economy over the past generation, and I would say the next generation, than China's development. Some of the numbers you know, but I think they bear mentioning. In 1980, according to the IMF's data, the U.S. was 24.6% of the global GDP measured in purchasing power terms, and China was 2.2% of the world GDP. This year, the IMF has estimated that the U.S. has gone from 24.6 to 19.8%, whereas China has gone from 2.2% to 15%. And on the estimates of the IMF out to 2017, of course, to be taken with the wide band of uncertainty, the IMF puts the U.S. at 17.7%, down from 19.8%, and puts China at 18.3%, in other words, larger than the U.S. already by 2017. This is of fundamental transformation significance. It has many implications for inside China. Probably the most dramatic is that in 1980, the poverty rate in China, measured by the World Bank's poverty level, was 73.5% poverty rate in 1980. And according to the World Bank's most recent estimate of 2008, the poverty rate was at 7.4%. There is no doubt in my mind that material conditions for the overwhelming majority of people in China have improved phenomenally and in an unprecedented manner, at an unprecedented speed and magnitude in the 30 years after 1980. Now, there's another side to it which is very significant, and that is that in 1980, U.S. carbon dioxide emissions were 4.9 billion tons, and China's were 1.4 billion tons, less than a third of the U.S., and in per capita terms, therefore, less than a 12th of America's. By 2009, China had overtaken the U.S. to become the world's largest carbon dioxide emitter and the largest emitter of greenhouse gases overall. As of 2009, China emitted 6.8 billion tons of CO2 compared to the U.S. 5.2 billion tons. China, more than any other part of the world, will determine the future health of the planet and the future of climate change and our ability to get it under control. Something of significance for the whole world, but of fundamental significance for China itself, because there are few places in the world more vulnerable than China as a highly populous, not only populous, densely populated country with roughly 19 or 20% of the world's population and about 7% of the world's land area and something like 7% of the world's water supply, and not evenly distributed within China. Climate change will have huge impacts within China, and China's the main driver in the world right now. By no means the only one, but it's about a quarter of total emissions. So it seems to me that China not only is making fundamental changes, but has become not only an important player, but a key driver of fundamental global scale development at this point. And I want to mention 4 of them and then talk about the coming 2 weeks, because they're of significance for the world in many ways. First, China has fundamentally affected the global division of labor. And my own view is that a lot of the slow growth in the United States and in Europe has its counterpart in China's fast growth. That's an unpopular view. Some of my colleagues at Columbia University will consider me absolutely heretical for saying it. I'm not saying that China did anything wrong. I'm just saying that the rapid rise of manufacturing, highly profitable in China, had as its counterpart some hollowing out of U.S. manufacturing over the last 30 years. And to think that it didn't, to my mind, would be surprising. U.S. employment in manufacturing declined from 19 million to 11 million jobs from 1980 till basically now. And while some of that is general technological change, Some of that is the loss of competitiveness, especially to China, but to the emerging economies in general. This doesn't mean that globalization isn't good or the trade isn't good. It's just one facet of how an adjustment to this phenomenally important economic transformation is taking place. And my own view is that some of the slow growth that Japan began to experience 20 years ago and the slow growth that the United States has experienced in the last 10 years and in Europe as well was partly the phenomenon that in this tradable goods industry, China was more competitive and had higher returns, and there was a tremendous, on the margin, a tremendous shift of new production capacity and so forth that had a global scale effect. Now, China's also had a global scale effect in spurring Africa's growth and in spurring Latin America's growth in the last 10 years. I think it's been the major reason for the higher growth rates in the primary commodity exporting regions, which have both experienced a tremendous last decade. I should add, by the way, in my own way of thinking, that the United States and Europe already experienced a significant slowing down of job growth 15 years ago. And part of it was this tremendous burst of success of China, and I'm not begrudging it for a moment. I just want to be very clear about this. I'm just describing. I applaud China's success completely. But one of the ways that the U.S. reacted to the weakening of jobs in the tradable sector was by trying to spur jobs in the non-traded sector, especially construction. So it's not, in my opinion, a complete accident that we had a housing bubble in the 2000s, because the Fed put the accelerator on in order to overcome chronic labor market weakness in a significant part of our economy. And this is a policy follow-on to how globalization has evolved. And my own view is the United States has done a miserable job of understanding globalization and responding effectively to it. And it has responded through creating bubbles and a boomlet in construction, which has more than disappeared, obviously, and it has not been able to focus on real competitiveness and a real long-term strategy that is compatible with the new world economy. The second thing that China has done is create a completely new environment of almost all primary commodities. Whether this survives or not depends on whether we have a collapse of the world economy or not, and I'll come to that in a moment. But since around 2004, all primary commodity classes have experienced a dramatic increase of real prices. This is in agriculture, in staples and non-staple agriculture. It's in virtually all minerals, and it's in hydrocarbons. This is an astounding change. Now, it's only 8 years in the making. It's had two cyclical declines, 2009 and 2012. So there have been corrections as the world economy has weakened. But my view is that we've entered an age of high real primary commodities prices on a persisting basis. If that's the case, it's nearly unprecedented in modern economic history, because 150 years was characterized by gradually declining real prices of commodities. And my view is basically that the world economy has gotten very crowded. The planet has not gotten bigger, but the world economy has gotten bigger, and it's pressing hard against conventional supplies and land and water and many of the other underpinnings of agricultural production, minerals production, and conventional oil production, and that this is therefore a fundamental driver. Other people disagree with that. We don't have a long enough time series to prove this one way or another. If the world economy were to collapse because of a financial crisis, for example, that starts in Europe next Sunday and then becomes a worldwide crisis, and it's not impossible, commodities prices will go down. What I'm saying is that at a nearly full employment world economy, commodities prices will be high in real terms compared to historical norms. And this is because, most importantly, the rise of China, but more generally, the rise of the world economy and the fact that the emerging economies have really emerged. The third aspect of this that I think is fundamental is what the geologists call the age of the Anthropocene, what some ecologists call the planetary boundaries, what we call the challenge of sustainable development. And that is that we do not have a world system and a set of technologies in place that can accommodate the kind of growth that we expect in the world economy in a sustainable manner. So if China continues to grow rapidly, and that might mean 6 or 7% per year rather than 10% per year, but if it does it following mainly the development track that it's following, which means lots of automobiles and big automobile-based cities, the world will absolutely, and I would include China within the world, face a crisis within decades of unprecedented severity and complication, because climate change, water scarcity, loss of biodiversity, ocean acidification, and many other human-driven anthropogenic forcings on the world will create havoc. They're already creating havoc, but not in the core economies right now. They're creating havoc in the weak places in the world. Already the Horn of Africa and the Sahel are virtually unlivable and ungovernable for tens of millions of people. And that is in part because they are very dry. And that is in part because the dry places in the world, like those places, are getting drier right now, because that's what one would expect from climate change. And we're already seeing catastrophe from this, but it will spread to more core parts of the world. I'm also considering Texas not a core part of the world, but some odd periphery with some very strange ideas that somehow emanate even to New York on occasion. But Texas is having one of its greatest droughts of modern history. And this is, in, I think, best evidence, a reflection of a deeper ecological footprint. China will be the major player in this change. This is not to say that there's something especially pernicious about China's role in this, because from a per capita point of view, the United States is much larger in its contributions to these changes. But China is big, and it is coal-based, and it needs food, and it's got water scarcity, and it imports a lot of feed grains, and it does a lot of things that affect the anthropogenic drivers all over the world, the most important of which is its CO2 emissions. The fourth point that I would say a fundamental change, of course, is geopolitics. China is simply central to global developments now, politically, militarily, security, economic, financial. And I think, in my own interpretation, this was not China's timetable. China wants 30 more years of quiet so that it can finish the catching up. It wants to be a good global citizen. It wants to have a world that is accommodative to continued rapid growth. Chinese leaders and the Chinese people know that China is still a middle-income country, not an economic powerhouse. There still is tremendous difficulty and fragility internally. And my own surmise is that from the Chinese leaders' point of view, the greatest thing in the world would be quiet for another 20 or 25 years. China is a good system player, in my opinion, which is that it wants to follow the rules, support multilateral institutions. It just wants also energy, food, and other things that it needs, and it wants the time to grow. But I don't think the world timetable will fit this hope anymore. China's too large not to be a major protagonist, not just a background supporter. And this will certainly be the case when China is the world's largest economy, which if it's not 2017 will be 2020 or 2025. And it is already the case when China is the world's largest emitter of greenhouse gases. And voracious in its appetite for coal, oil, copper, iron ore, and many other things. Now, all of this could change if China went into a crisis. I believe China will not go into such a crisis, and that this was not a bubble that's going to burst and we're all going to rub our eyes and say, how could we ever have believed that? I think what's happening is far more fundamental. There's a recent book by Daron Acemoglu and James Robinson, which says that China is basically following the Soviet model. Don't get too excited about this. It's all going to collapse. I think this is wrong fundamentally. Knowing the Soviet experience, the Soviet Union did not develop in a context of globalization. And so when its crisis hit, it was not part of a global system at all. This is completely different, in my view, from China's reality, because China is developing as part of the world productive systems, the world technology systems. It's contributing to them. It's a vital part of it, which was not true of the Soviet Union. So I think the analogies are very, very weak and poor in the analysis that says it's all about to come to a screeching halt, or that this is like a Soviet buildup. I believe that China's development is driven fundamentally by technological improvements that are the same technologies as the whole world is using. That's good news from the point of view of this not being evanescent. It's not a complete answer from the point of view of us destroying the environment and the planet. And just to remind you, if China were actually to mimic the US and catch up, there would be 1 billion more cars on the road. Of course, given China's size, China would be nothing but a parking lot or a traffic jam. So there's something impossible with that scenario. But China's already the world's largest automobile market, and it's likely to remain so for the next 20 years. But China has to have a strategy that accommodates this. All of this is to say the timetable for China to just be a good player in a world system somehow managed by the US or by the G8 or by nobody, that's gone. China's now fundamentally a protagonist. Given that, we have a real issue, which is that there really are kind of 3 models of global politics that we can imagine. There could be a kind of balance of power politics, which is peaceful and mutually respectful of space and power and influence, kind of a concert of Europe vision that maybe Henry Kissinger would like, that could work. There could be a competition model in which China's growth drives the US absolutely crazy, and the US craze drives China into greater nationalism. And we've had that dynamic twice in the 20th century with Germany. And it's just absolutely the most risky thing that the whole world can have. And the third, which I believe, by the way, is the only thing that can work, is something we've never had before, and that's close global cooperation. The reason I think that that is necessary is that I believe that these environmental challenges are unprecedented, and that they are a different kind of problem from the problems that humanity has faced in the past. In the past, humanity had enough space to leave each other more or less to do their thing, and the question was whether the kings idiotically went to war or not, or whether the rulers of the tyrants idiotically went to war. We're in a very different situation, in my view, right now, which is that we actually need to do something humanity has never done before and has no taste to do, and that is to transform fundamentally the world's energy and technology systems within the next 40 years. I say we don't have a taste to do it in the shadow of the next 2 weeks. So let me say something about the next 2 weeks. The next 2 weeks have 3 big events. One is the Greek election on Sunday, and that by itself could be the start of the biggest financial crisis, not since 2008, but since 1929. Because if the Eurozone implodes or explodes right now, the ramifications of that for the world, I think, could be extraordinary. And when Chinese major investors have said in the last few weeks, we're out of Europe right now, we'll just wait and see. And when the money is fleeing Spain, Italy, Greece, Portugal, in what is really a banking panic within the Eurozone taking place, it's very fragile what's happening. And if Greece, just to throw a scenario out, which you all know, but if Greece elects a government that is committed to tearing up agreements with Europe, not that I have any admiration for those agreements, but if it elects a populist government that says this is absurd, we default, and so forth, which is by no means sure, but is a possibility. The ramifications of that, in my view, would be very large, and the contagion would be not contained to Greece. I don't see any way that Greece could have a rupture within Europe, a collapse, a default, without devastating Spain, Italy, and others. That's my own macroeconomic view. So that's event number one. Then event number two was the G20 meeting in Los Cabos in Mexico, which maybe will be a great, exciting meeting to pick up the pieces after the Greek disaster. And so I'm looking forward to that meeting. I'll be there with Secretary General. I hope it will not be devoted to that. The G20 has proven to be, at some moments, rather impressive. I've been to almost all of the G20 meetings. One thing I would say about them is that the presentations of most of the leadership are strong and serious. It's actually a little frightening to be in these rooms with all the leaders there. They're not necessarily solving the problems, but the meetings are quite serious, actually, and so I've been impressed by them. But the level of cooperation and practicality that has come out of them has been extremely low. And so we've not really had practical problem solving come out of the G20, at least not since 2009. And 2009 wasn't really cooperation. It was mostly a lot of countries pointing in the same direction for their own reason, rather than a lot of cooperation. So the G20 will meet next. And then after that will be the Rio +20 summit. It's quite a lineup, because the Rio +20 summit is 20 years after the Earth Summit. The Earth Summit produced 3 major treaties, one on climate change, one on biological diversity, and one on combating desertification. Not one of these treaties had any effect, I would say, or almost any effect. They have been more or less a bonanza for conferences over 20 years. Diplomats have had a great time negotiating what's legally binding, what's measurable, what's verifiable, but nothing has changed, except that climate change has gotten worse, biological diversity has continued its collapse, and desertification has roared forward in the Sahel and the Horn of Africa. So the record is miserable, actually. And to add to the misery, after the Climate Change Convention was signed and actually ratified by the U.S. Senate, believe it or not, because the U.S. Senate would never ratify anything right now. Anything that involves another country is inherently suspect in the United States, much less something for the whole world. That means that that must mean that it is absolutely a dire threat to the United States. So in 1997, the Senate voted 95-0, don't agree on anything on climate change until China does the same, basically. This was the Byrd-Hagel Amendment. That's an example of being driven a little crazy by the competition with China. Because under the law of the treaty, the U.S. was to move first. Under the practicalities, the U.S. should have moved first. Under historical responsibility, the U.S. should have moved first. Under technology, the U.S. should move first. But it was absolutely saying, we cannot move. Our competitor is gaining on us. And so this is the kind of thing that absolutely can break the logic of the system. Oh, God. It would be great if we could meet in 2 weeks and see whether we're still here and where we're going. I'll tell you what I'm hoping for. I still am hoping, maybe naively, I'm told constantly, for that cooperative approach, because I don't really see another way, and because I actually think all of our problems, even Greece and Spain, even climate change, are eminently solvable. That is what I feel is the most persistent, deeper truth of our time. We're actually in good shape in the world in the most important way, which is we have the know-how, we have the spread of literacy, awareness, information to actually solve all our problems. That's phenomenal. And the spread of information technology and connectedness is mind-boggling. The villages that we work in Africa 7 years ago didn't have a phone of any kind. And now mobile and soon 3G will be completely pervasive. Our ability to solve these problems is absolutely at hand. What I'm hoping will come out of Rio Plus 20, something that I've been working on and Secretary General Ban Ki-moon is leading, is the concept that the world will adopt sustainable development goals, not for the lawyers and the diplomats, not to be ratified by the U.S. Senate, but actually for us, humanity, civil society, the people of the world, the school children, the universities, the businesses, so that we can move beyond these empty negotiations and actually move to solve real problems. And I know that that's exactly the spirit of this conference, and I know with so many friends here it is the spirit that has engaged so many of you for many, many years. So let's keep good heart. Let's hope that Greece, the G20, and the world, in that order, in the next 2 weeks, does its job, and then we can get to the real problem solving. Thank you very much.
We can take 2 questions. Why don't I collect both questions and attend to Jeff before we go to the panel, if there's a demand. Peter.
Two questions within one question. Just on the commodity terms of trade. You mentioned the huge impact that China has had on Africa and Latin America, and surely that's importantly a supply response to the shift in the commodity terms of trade and will bring the real price of commodities back. like the comments on that because it relates to the basically limits of growth dimension to your presentation. The second one is really on global cooperation and where the locus of change might be there. I mean, you're pretty pessimistic by implication on the established forums. Where do you see it coming from? What you suggested at the end was a movement for sustainable development. That's a whole collectivity of national political agendas in some way or other. How do you do that?
I'll take one more question.
Okay, good.
It's about the adjustment in a response to what you said earlier on expansion of the economy, and then we ran into financial global crisis. So my own assumption is that if we got into big trouble, we probably need to take some pain in order to go on. But you look at around the world, most of the countries, governments, and the central banks are very reluctant to take the pains. Whenever the economy is slow, they start printing money again, expand on the fiscal deficit. In fact, the ironic thing is that the Chinese government is the only one who is talking about maybe slower growth is necessary. What's your response?
Great. Thanks a lot. So on the question of resource prices and supply, as I mentioned briefly, and as you know, over a very long period of time, roughly 150 years, real commodities prices tended to decline. And this seemed to indicate that the Malthusian fear of the finitude of the planet was somehow wrong in the sense that technology could overcome the limits that the world faces. After 1970, that downward long-term trend became quite volatile and erratic. We had high commodities prices in the 70s and limits to growth. We had a collapse of commodities prices in the 80s and 90s. Then we've had a restoration of commodities prices starting from the early 2000s. So it's a little dangerous to proclaim a new era, and the first thing that would be said is that when commodities prices are high, they elicit a supply response, they elicit substitution, they elicit new technologies. I have to say I'm a bit of a conditional Malthusian. And by conditional Malthusian, I mean the following. A lot of what got the prices down over time was learning how to mine nature better. So it's not that we economized on resource use. We just were able to dig it out better and fish it out better and mine it out better and pump it out better and so forth. And I am persuaded, certainly because I head an environmental institute as well, filled with hundreds of ecologists and climatologists and so forth, to believe that we've really reached some very serious supply challenges that can't anymore be met by better mining, pumping, dredging, and so forth. Now, in the United States, we're in the middle of a very exciting boomlet on shale gas, which is supposed to disprove this proposition. I think if you look at the numbers, you see that this is something real, but it's several parts hype for each part fundamental solution, because even if it's there, it's not really a fundamental game changer if the world economy continues to grow fast, which is by no means assured. But I'm asking the question, can the world economy continue to grow as the world hopes it will? That means developing countries catching up in a way that would be compatible with our current technology base. And I think the answer is no. Climate change will destabilize a lot of food production. Ocean acidification will destabilize marine environments. Even conventional supplies of some key resources, probably conventional petroleum, will make a big difference. certainly the conventional the supplies of fossil water will be depleted. That means the aquifers in major areas of the world, and if not fossil water, at least slowly recharging aquifers like northern China, like the Indo-Gangetic Plains, like the Ogallala Reservoir in the American Midwest, are on a downward course right now. So my view is that we've entered a new era, even with supply responses. Now, what's also true is that we have no limit to energy if we were to harness solar power on a massive scale, because insolation is about 10,000 times our energy use right now, our global power supply. We tap almost none of it. Much of it we won't be able to tap economically, but there's a lot of solar power. There's a lot of potential nuclear power. But we have huge problems to mobilize those or to accept their costs. And I'm not persuaded, therefore, that we really can avoid rising marginal cost curves for a lot of commodities right now. That's my basic take. We're $70 trillion annual production right now, with a world that, if you add it up in terms of what is seen as, quote, normal, would grow at about 4% per year. And 4% per year growth means doubling every 18 years. So by 2030, we would be at 140 trillion. And if we did that one more time, for example, which would, well, you can double it again. The point I should make is that if the whole world were to converge at the high income levels from where it is right now, and the rich countries were never to grow again, but just to stay where we are, which may be optimistic, by the way, but if that were to be the case, that would be a fourfold increase of production. And then if you add in the momentum on population, that would be another 40% or so. So we have built into the political DNA of the world maybe a six-fold increase. There's no way on current technologies that our resource base can support that, either our ecosystem services or, I believe, a lot of crucial commodities. So I think that this is a real issue that is persistent. A lot of places that grow a lot of food right now, we talk about increasing it as if we can surely hold the production. But we can't necessarily even hold the production in a lot of places as the climate changes, as the water situation gets more concerning, and so on. I'll put together these two questions of accepting pain or getting out of this, how to get out of this crisis, and how to create some kind of movement of sustainable development. Oh. It's very hard because we're working on the politicians' timetables right now. And we're not working on the realities of the world right now. The United States is a great example of a country that has everything you could ever imagine, and yet seems determined to squander a lot of it, because we can't even have a grown-up discussion in this country anymore. And the level of our political discussion is so abysmal that it's unrecognizable, in my view. The word climate probably won't be mentioned for the next 4 months. President Obama will not go to the Rio +20 summit, even though 150 other world leaders will be there, because nothing could be worse for him than to attend a UN function. And so this is really bad, because we need some cooperation. And if the president can't even see fit to go to a meeting where 150 or so of his counterparts are discussing the future of the planet, you can judge how difficult this environment is right now. The problem is that or not the problem, the good part is the public is way ahead of the governments, actually, I believe. That may be a little optimistic, but at least partly ahead. But the noise factor is phenomenal, and the noise factor is very powerful corporate lobbies which finance most of the noise and which are absolutely out to confuse everybody on just about everything. And this, if companies would behave themselves, that would take us about 80% of where we need to go. Because nothing has done more damage in the United States than corporate propaganda, and everything is propagandized right now. Every political message is driven by big money, and it's all confusion, top to bottom. There's not a sensible message in it. And we built a world, and China's becoming increasingly comfortable and part of it, of tax havens and hiding income. And you look at where most of China's overseas foreign development goes. It's the British Virgin Islands, it's the Cayman Islands, it's Hong Kong, and it's other tax havens. And this is the phony world that the real world is supposed to live on and solve our problems. No one's immune to big money in politics, and it's the most destructive thing of all. Because if people would actually understand the problems, be explained, and told what's at stake for their children, we'd actually solve these problems. So that's why I come back to the idea of more of a social movement and an educational movement and an awareness movement rather than a political movement. I've been part of something called the Millennium Development Goals for the last 12 years, and while those to fight poverty, hunger, and disease, while they haven't succeeded, they've succeeded a lot more than those 3 international treaties. They've had real effect because the lawyers and the diplomats weren't discussing what's legally binding, what's verifiable, who has to do what. It was a call to action globally that has resonated quite deeply. My view is most of the world would like a future for the planet, future for their children, future for climate change. Most of the world would like to tap renewable energy. We have a lot of polling data to show all these things. And we can't get it done because of the big money in politics right now. And so if we can put society back to where it's supposed to be, and this is no matter what form of government, democracy, non-democracy, this is really about voice of people versus voice of interests. We don't have a working system right now. And I'll just end by telling you one story. That 95-0 resolution in the Byrd-Hagel Amendment, which said we won't do anything until the developing countries do, was the basic amendment. And every senator signed up to this. One of the authors of it was Robert Byrd, who was in many ways a great senator. Byrd gave a speech on climate change one day, which is completely remarkable. He was the senator of West Virginia. West Virginia is a major coal state. And he gave a speech. I need to dig it out again because it was so stunning. It was 2 pages in the congressional record, which said climate change is the most important issue for the world and for our children. It threatens the whole planet. It's terrible. It's disaster and so forth. And he literally 2 pages, and the last paragraph is, therefore, it is with great regret that I will have to vote against this legislation. And the reason he was voting against it was he represented a coal state, and he could count the interests and so forth. And everything was there except the vote at the end. And this is a little bit what we face with the politicians. And if we can bring the people to the forefront, we can help the politicians out of their agony right now. I have no doubt that President Obama would love to talk morning, noon, and night about climate, and I have little doubt that he won't even mention the word for the next 4 months. And that's our problem that we have to help solve. Thanks.